All right, ready to get a little philosophical. Today we're going deep on fatalism.
Oh, this is going to be
It
good.
really is. It's a fascinating concept when you think about it.
Yeah.
That we're, well, powerless to do anything other than what we actually end up doing. And, for someone like you, a philosopher, this isn't just some lighthearted, whatever happens, happens type of thing.
Yeah.
This gets right to the heart of free will, choice, all that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Fatalism really throws a wrench into how we think about those big ideas. Agency, responsibility, what it even means to make a choice.
Exactly. And to help us navigate this philosophical maze, we're turning to, as always, a trusty source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on fatalism.
Always a good starting point.
I know these encyclopedia entries can be, well, a little dense sometimes, but trust me, we're going to pull out the most interesting, most thought-provoking parts and make this deep dive both understandable and, dare I say, even a little fun.
I have faith in us.
Me too.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting about fatalism is that it comes in different flavors, right?
Right, exactly. You've got logical fatalism, which comes straight from, well, the rules of logic.
Okay.
And then you've got theological fatalism, which is where things get really interesting because that brings ground knowledge into the picture.
Okay, so let's start with logical fatalism then, the one grounded in pure reason. And I feel like there's no better place to start than with the OG logician himself, Aristotle.
Oh, always a good place to start. So, in one of his works called De Interpretatione, Aristotle brings up this really interesting thought experiment. So, picture this. It's the year 1900, okay?
Right, I'm picturing it.
And you have two people. One of them says a sea battle will happen on January 1st, 2100.
Okay.
The other one says, nope, no sea battle on that date.
Okay, going out on a limb there.
Right. So Aristotle's point is, even way back in 1900, one of those people has to be right.
Logically, yeah.
Right. Which kind of implies, doesn't it, that the future, in a sense, is already set.
Hold on. So you're saying that just by making a statement about the future, we're somehow locking it in. That seems a little, I don't know, oversimplified, don't you think?
Yeah, I get your skepticism. And you know what? Aristotle himself actually had a solution he proposed. He said statements about the future, they're not really true or false in the present. They only become true or false when the event actually happens.
Okay.
Which it gets into a whole debate about the nature of truth, the nature of time, but it basically, delays the problem a little bit.
Right, so we're in this weird truth limbo until the year 2100 rolls around.
Yeah.
And that sea battle either happens or doesn't happen.
Exactly.
But does that really solve the problem, though? I mean, what if someone made that prediction even earlier, like in the year 1800? Are we just pushing the problem further back?
That's a great question. And that's where this guy, Diodorus Cronus, comes in with his very famous master argument.
Okay, tell me more.
So Diodorus was all about the necessity of the past. He said, look, everything that has happened, it had to happen that way.
Okay, so no changing the past. Got it.
Exactly. But then you add in this idea, if something will happen, then it was true in the past that it would happen. You see how this starts to build a pretty strong case for fatalism.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how this logic trap closes in.
Right.
So if the sea battle does happen in 2100, then it must have been true even way back in 1900, even in 1800, that it was going to happen. There's no escaping it.
That's the gist of it.
Yeah.
That's the gist of it. But of course, as with any good philosophical debate, there are counter arguments.
Oh, good, because I'm already starting to feel a little
I
trapped.
hear you. So one of the counter arguments, it tries to distinguish between hard facts about the past and soft facts about the past.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hard facts versus soft facts. Explain it to me.
Okay, so a hard fact, it's something like the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. That's set in stone, unchangeable.
Right.
A soft fact, on the other hand, it depends on the future. Like, imagine someone in 1950 saying, humans will walk on the moon someday. Now, technically that was true, right? But did saying it make it happen?
So it becomes a fact after the event, kind of like a backwards self-fulfilling prophecy.
You got it.
Okay, so I see how that weakens the argument a little, but does it really demolish it completely? I'm not sure.
That's up for debate. And to make things even more complicated, we have another philosopher, Richard Taylor, coming in with his own argument about what it means to have the power to act.
Okay, bring on the challenge.
Mm.
I'm ready for it. What did Richard Taylor have to say?
So Taylor, he starts with these assumptions that seem pretty common sense, pretty basic when you think about actions and what has to be in place for them to happen. Like, you can't do something if the right conditions aren't there.
Yeah, makes sense.
Right. Like, you can't bake a cake without flour.
Yeah, although I have been known to get a little creative in the kitchen.
Sure. But Taylor, he takes this idea a step further. He says, if you really trace back all the conditions that need to be in place for a Nivek action, you'll eventually reach a point where you had no control over those conditions.
Okay, I need an example. I'm a philosopher. I think in examples.
All right, let's stick with our sea battle. To order a sea battle, you need a navy, you need a reason to fight, right, and all that. But those conditions, they depend on other conditions, your birth, the state of your society, and so on, further and further back. And Taylor's point is that somewhere in that chain of conditions, you weren't the one making the decisions.
So even something that seems as deliberate as, I don't know, ordering a sea battle is ultimately the result of things that were set in motion long before I was even born. I could see how that would lead to a feeling of, I don't know, powerlessness.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
It is. But isn't there a flaw in that argument, though? It seems to define power in a very, I don't know, narrow way. Like it assumes we can only act if we control literally every single condition that leads up to that action.
That's a really good point. And you're right, some philosophers do push back on Taylor's definition of power. They say, look, we can still have the power to act even if we didn't personally create every condition that made that action possible.
Right, exactly. It can't all be preordained.
Exactly. But even with that counter argument, even with those criticisms, logical fatalism, it's a really thought-provoking idea to wrestle with.
It is. It is. And speaking of thought-provoking, I think it's time we move on to that other type of fatalism you mentioned, right? Theological fatalism. The idea that maybe God knowing everything actually limits our free will.
Oh, yeah. Let's dive into that. We're going from the realm of pure logic to the realm of, well, divine knowledge, which, as you might imagine, gets even more complex. So we've been digging into this whole logical fatalism thing, but now let's add another layer, another wrinkle to this. Let's bring God into the picture.
Okay, yeah.
Theological fatalism, right? It gets into how God knowing everything, if you believe in that, might actually stack the deck even further against this idea of free will.
Yeah, I mean, things definitely feel a lot more, I don't know, weighty when we start talking about God.
Right.
So walk me through this. How does God knowing everything potentially lead to this idea of fatalism?
All right, let's put on our hypothetical hats for a second. Imagine you are God. You have perfect knowledge. You know everything that will ever happen. Past, present, future, the whole 9 yards.
The ultimate knowledge.
Right. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, you know, for certain that on January 1st, 2000, someone named Jones is going to mow their lawn.
Okay, all right. God's got the ultimate lawn care schedule memorized.
Right.
But where's the conflict here?
Yeah.
What's the problem?
Okay, here's the twist. If God already knew, way back in, let's say, 1900, that Jones was going to mow that lawn in 2000, did Jones really have a choice? Could they have chosen not to mow the lawn, even though God already knew they would? This is the essence of the argument made by a philosopher named Nelson Pike.
Ah, I see. I see the dilemma. If we're accepting that God's knowledge is, infallible, then it kind of seems like Jones's actions are predetermined.
Exactly.
Their free will just goes right out the window.
That's Pike's point, yeah. He's saying if you're going to embrace this idea of divine omniscience, then you're kind of stuck with at least some version of fatalism. And this has been a real head-scratcher for theologians, for philosophers, for centuries, right? Trying to figure out how to reconcile this idea of God's knowledge with human freedom. That's a tough one.
So what are some of the ways they've tried to, I don't know, get around this? Are there any escape routes?
Yeah.
Is there any way to salvage this idea of free will in a universe where God's already seen the whole movie, so to speak?
Yeah, let's look at a few of the more, I guess, popular ideas, right? So one is this idea that maybe God's knowledge isn't bound by time in the same way that ours is. He's outside of time, right? He's a timeless observer.
Okay.
So think of it like God sees all of time at once, like all at once. It's not so much predicting the future as perceiving all moments equally.
Right.
This is often called the Boethian solution, named after the philosopher Boethius.
Okay. So from God's perspective, it's not so much this will happen. It's more like everything just is all at the same time. It's kind of like how we experience a song. Like we hear a whole song even though the notes are played one after another.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. But does that really solve the problem, though?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Some critics, some philosophers, they argue it just kind of pushes the problem back a step.
Right.
Because if everything is fixed from God's timeless perspective, we're still in a predetermined universe. We're just shifting the framework a little bit. Where does our free will actually fit into that picture?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we're just trading one type of predetermination for another type of predetermination, aren't we?
Yeah, you could say that. So what are some other options? Well, what if we rethink what we even mean by God's knowledge? Maybe it's not about beliefs in the way that we as humans think about beliefs. Maybe it's a more direct kind of knowing, like a pure awareness.
Okay.
It's not about judging or predicting. It's just pure perception of what S equals.
So it's almost like God is this, I don't know, cosmic security camera, just observing, recording things, but not really having any emotional investment or bias towards what's happening.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And some philosophers, they argue that this kind of knowledge, it wouldn't mess with free will because it's not like God's forcing anything on us, right?
Yeah.
It's just pure observation.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, this idea that God has this all-encompassing knowledge, it still feels a little, I don't know, stifling. Even if it's not like he's directly interfering.
I get that. I get that. And that leads to another possible solution. Maybe God's omniscience. Maybe it's not as absolute as we tend to think, you know?
Oh.
Maybe his perfection, it doesn't require him to know literally every single tiny detail of our lives.
Right.
Maybe he chooses to limit his knowledge, to give us some space, some genuine freedom to make our own choices.
So God's intentionally leaving us a little wiggle room, you know?
Yeah.
Respecting our autonomy. I like that. It's much more comforting than the other options.
It is. It is. But even if we go with that idea, we're not quite out of the woods philosophically. There's this other concept that we have to grapple with, and it's a real doozy, even for philosophers who've been thinking about this stuff for a long time. And it's called middle knowledge.
Middle knowledge. Okay, that sounds very mysterious.
It is. It really is. And it stretches the imagination.
All right, hit me with it. What is this middle knowledge all about?
Imagine that God doesn't just know what will happen, but also what everyone would do in every possible situation.
Okay.
It's not just knowing the script, it's like knowing every possible ad lib, every alternate ending, based on any choice any being could possibly make.
Whoa, okay. That's a lot of knowledge to hold.
It is.
How does that connect to fatalism?
Okay, so think about it this way. If God knows what I would do in absolutely any scenario, does that mean my choices are actually already set?
Oh.
It's like he's seen every version of me that there could be, and he knows exactly how I'll react no matter what happens.
Wow, yeah. That's taking this whole predetermination thing to a whole other level. It makes even logical fatalism seem pretty tame by comparison.
It's a mind-bending concept. And some people argue that middle knowledge, this is like the most extreme version of theological fatalism. It doesn't leave much room for free will at all.
So are we doomed then? Is our fate sealed by this all-knowing, middle-knowing God?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Even with middle knowledge, there are still some philosophical moves you can make to try to find some space for human freedom.
Okay.
But to do that, we'd have to really get into the weeds of what free will even means. And as you can probably imagine, that's a whole other philosophical rabbit hole we could go down.
Wow. Okay, so we've really gone through it with logical fatalism, with theological fatalism, all these arguments about God's knowledge. And then you throw middle knowledge into the mix. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It really is. It's a lot to process. But that's part of what makes philosophy so fascinating, right? It's these really big questions that we're wrestling with.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get too existential, I feel like there's one more fatalism-related argument that we should at least touch on.
Okay.
And it's this thing called the idol argument. And I think this one really gets to how fatalism might actually play out in our, everyday lives.
Right, right. It's a very practical way of looking at it.
Yeah, exactly.
So the idol argument, it goes something like this. If it's already fated that I'm going to recover from this illness, why bother even going to the doctor? And on the other hand, if I'm fated to die, well, seeing a doctor won't make a difference anyway.
Right.
So the question then becomes, what's the point of doing anything at all?
Yeah, it's like the ultimate whatever argument, right? Like, why bother? It's all predetermined anyway.
Yeah.
Which is tempting, but also kind of terrifying. If you really think about it, it could lead to some serious inaction, right? Like just giving up on everything.
Yeah, it's definitely a slippery slope. But luckily, we have some ancient wisdom that can help us out here.
Yeah.
So this Stoic philosopher, Chrysippus, he offered a pretty clever response to the idol argument.
Okay, tell me, Chrysippus saved us from a life of just sitting on the couch and doing nothing.
Well, at least he pointed out the flaw in the logic. So Chrysippus, he said, look, even if it's fated that you'll recover, it might be fated that you'll recover because you went to the doctor.
Okay.
So the action and the outcome, they're not separate. They might actually be part of the same predetermined plan.
Oh, okay. So it's not about whether the destination is fixed. It's about whether the steps we take to get there are also part of that, preordained path.
Exactly. I see that.
That
Yeah.
makes a lot more sense, actually.
Right.
Yeah, so it's not a free pass to just give up and let fate just happen to us.
Right. Chrysippus's response, it reminds us that even in a universe that might be completely predetermined, our choices, they still matter. They might be threads in this larger tapestry, but they're still contributing to the overall design.
So we can't just sit back and say, well, it's fate, there's nothing I can do.
Yeah.
We still have a responsibility to act, to make choices,
Right.
even if we believe that there's some level of predetermination.
That's a great point, and it brings up this even bigger question. Like, what does fatalism really mean for meaningful action? Even if everything is predetermined, does that mean our lives are meaningless? Or can we find meaning in the journey itself, in the choices that we make along the way, regardless of where we end up?
It's a question that philosophers have been grappling with for, well, probably as long as there have been philosophers. And I don't think there's an easy answer. But this whole deep dive into fatalism, it's been so valuable. We've explored the logic behind it. We've looked at how it relates to God and this idea of God's knowledge. We even touched on some of the practical implications of it with the idol argument. I mean, we've encountered some truly brilliant minds along the way. Aristotle, Diodorus, Taylor, Pike, Boethius, Chrysippus. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I think, if there's one thing we can take away from all of this, it's that this whole debate about fatalism, it's far from settled. There are really compelling arguments on both sides. And ultimately, I think it's up to each individual to grapple with these ideas, to weigh the evidence and come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, and that's what's so great about it, right?
Yeah.
We're not given a neat little answer tied up in a bow. We have to think for ourselves. We have to wrestle with these ideas and figure out what we believe. But before we wrap up, I have to ask, if you could ask an all-knowing being, like one question, just one question, to get to the bottom of this whole fatalism mystery, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me think. I think I would ask, is there even one choice, like even a tiny, seemingly insignificant choice that I could have made differently? A choice that would have led to a different outcome in my life? And if the answer is yes, then maybe there is more room for free will than a strictly fatalistic view would allow. But if the answer is no, then maybe we really are just playing out these predetermined roles in some grand cosmic play.
That's a really, really thought-provoking question to end on. It leaves us with this sense of mystery, of possibility. Maybe our fate isn't completely sealed after all, right?
Right.
Maybe we do have the power to influence the course of our lives, even if it's just in small ways. And to our listener out there, I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into fatalism. It's a complex topic, but it's one that's worth thinking about, worth exploring.
Absolutely. And I encourage you to keep learning, to keep asking those tough questions. Read more about these thinkers we've discussed, dive deeper into the arguments for and against fatalism.
Because that's what makes us human, right? Our curiosity, our desire to understand ourselves and the universe around us. And even if we never have all the answers, even if we're never totally certain, the journey of exploration, it's valuable in itself. So keep diving deep. And until next time, keep your mind open and engaged.